the primogenitor, the first big clash was over the right of ownership of the land, because the Norman system was the eldest son, the primogenitor, becomes the chief or owns the land, and that won out to a large extent, especially on the large at the top levels. It didn't down in and that can be a little misleading, because in the land that was owned on a leasehold, or that's where the word real estate, real, comes from the king. It's not real in the sense of real is not real. It's real, royal, real estate. So an estate that comes from the king. So in the estates that were passed down through lesser, they would tend to be more tribal. But the large overall tract, that would have been controlled by a family based on primogeniture, which was the beginnings of a lot of the problems that later, then it became a huge problem by the time the Tudors came along, because they really enforced it. And it wasn't until 1603 that pretty well the Irish law was gone. But throughout that period that we're talking about, the Irish Gaelic Brehon law survived, almost totally intact, right up to the top levels, where it didn't matter to the ordinary folks. So that the Normans did not really interfere with how many cows you have to give this guy for killing his son-in-law or whatever. That's the way deals were settled. And as you know, or may not know, I don't know, we'll talk about that at the shiring, how they tried to shire, But the way the fundamental principle of the system was that when an individual committed a crime, his entire family, extended family, paid in fines to the offended person. And the idea was that little brat will never do that again. Society don't take him out and put him in a jail or somewhere. His family now are suffering because they've had to give up X number of, depending, because the Brehon, the judge, had a whole law. He says, well, no, and depending on the level, by the way, it was a hierarchical society, so depending on who he had hurt or raped or what he had stolen from or whose horse he had stolen, all of those things. And I wish we could rediscover it to some extent again, where keep that fellow under lock and key, and nobody would better to keep him in line than the family, the village itself. Anyway, that worked, and the Normans were practical enough not to mess with it. Now, the English had done this shiring system, and that goes back to King John, although it wasn't he, it was the lords, and they set up a system which survives to this day. They set up what's called a shire, only now it's called a county, and they appointed a chief law enforcement officer called a sheriff, which has to do with the shire, the shire, and that's why in England, it's like Hampshire. Pardon? Yeah, Worcestershire, all these, so that was and the idea was that they would have one law. It was actually a great thing. It was one of the better things that ever happened. But it was the barons that did it. John was just an idiot, really signed whatever he was told, which was fine. In many ways, it was fortunate for England that they went through a period where they had a weak king. But there was a lot of very good people, administrators around at the time. And basically what they did in England was they said it's going to be one law from one end of the kingdom to the other. And then you have these circuit courts and sessions, and so the king's judge went on a circuit court, and all of it came around that period. Now, that didn't happen in Ireland. It was resisted because of the Brehon laws. They didn't really have any deep inbuilt, because remember, England had been overrun by various tribes. It didn't have that sort of, and the Romans had been there for a long time before that, and Boadicea had been wiped out. So they didn't really have that long tradition going back. But the Irish did. They had deep roots that hadn't been upset or disturbed for many, many centuries. which had its good and bad points. Anyway, it just took a long time to die, I suppose, in Ireland. But anyway, I suppose they just thought it's just not worth it in Ireland. We're not going to do that. We're not going to go down that road in Ireland. And they did it on paper, but it never really worked. And even to this day, the fundamental divisions of Ireland go back to the old baronies, to the old divisions which were adopted by the church. There's some excellent books written by churchmen about this, how the church, the Roman church, adapted itself to these divisions, which they called dioceses and even parishes. And they were very natural and go way back into the mist of time. Whereas the Normans in England drew lines on the map and pretty well set up, and they did it's kind of like what they kind of gerrymandered it, and they did it based upon their statistics, how many people lived there, how many cows there was in the area, so that it would support and so on. Because I'm sure you've all heard of the Domesday Book. No, you have. The Domesday Book was an inventory. Can you imagine trying to do that nowadays? But in those days, there was a very limited amount of wealth so they actually literally wrote down every pig and chicken and cow and calf and everything and everybody that they had because the Normans, the Norman king, wanted to know, so what have I got here? what did I conquer? And they went out. It's an amazing thing, actually. It's an incredible thing. So that the Domesday Book, and that's part of the history of how they got them to participate in it. It was a civil act, but they put a little religious kick onto it, and they, this was God that was doing this. That somebody had told, So that's kind of how it got into that's called the Domesday Book, because it had to do with the final reckoning and all that stuff. Anyway, that was the basis for a lot of the administration in England. It goes back to the Domesday Book, and that was entered in under this little section, and that's it. We have enough there now. We'll start a new section out over here, which has the stamp of a colonizer. What we did here in America, Europeans in America. But the Irish didn't do that. The things go back to much, much earlier, and the Normans quite wisely left it there. You can also see that reflects and is in many ways proof that there was an incredibly old working civilization in Ireland, which was so entrenched that any smart invader or administrator said, look, let's just work with what we got here. Tried up is just not worth the candle. So that certainly explains why the Normans appeared to become more Irish than the Irish themselves in that sense. Anyway, I want to talk about how that actually worked out, because it's very, very interesting how it worked out. There was essentially only basically 3-4 families that thrived into the Norman invasion, because remember now it was John that kind of gave it its stamp. The Strongbow and that was just like a beachhead, a small. So the big, and what he did was he just gave huge titles and huge tracts of land to his pages. They were all personal servants of his, the guys that scrubbed his back, the guy that did his laundry, literally. But of course, they were also noble people too. So they weren't just, serve. To become a servant to the king, you did come from a noble family. So there's in that sense. But that's essentially what they were. So the Fitzgeralds were by far the biggest, and the Burkes and the Butlers. So those three account for the original real aristocracy, if you like, of the Northern Ireland. Now,